On an ordinary morning, a single object turned a quiet marriage into a crime scene. While searching for a receipt, he found condoms in his wife's purse, the kind they had never used, the kind she once mocked as unnecessary for faithful people. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with a cold, creeping disbelief. He didn't confront her. He didn't shout. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He removed them and replaced them with a photo from their wedding day, a smiling reminder of vows that suddenly felt staged, rehearsed, and possibly never real. From that moment on, every kiss felt like evidence, every excuse like a cover story. What began as a quiet suspicion would unravel into betrayal, manipulation, and a truth far darker than infidelity. Before we dive into this story, comment your city and local time below. I love seeing where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that uncover what people hide behind love. He didn't sleep that night. The ceiling fan traced slow, useless circles above him, while his mind replayed the same image over and over. The unopened box, tucked neatly beside lipstick and breath mints, like it belonged there. In the dark, he listened to his wife's breathing, steady and calm, the sound of someone unburdened by secrets. He wondered how long that peace had existed, and whether it had ever been real. By morning, he had decided two things. First, he would not accuse her without certainty. Second, he would not beg for a truth she might never willingly give. If his marriage had become a performance, then he would sit in the audience and watch carefully at breakfast. She kissed his cheek and asked if he wanted eggs or toast. Her voice was warm, practiced. He studied the way she avoided his eyes for half a second too long, how her phone buzzed and she flipped it face down without thinking. These were tiny things and meaningless on their own, but together they formed a rhythm he couldn't unhear. He went to work and barely remembered the drive. At his desk, numbers blurred, emails went unread. All he could think about was the photo now sitting in her purse, the one from their wedding day, the moment she would see it, the moment confusion would flicker across her face before instinct took over. That moment would tell him everything. When he came home that evening, she was late. Not unusually late, she said later. Just traffic. Just a meeting that ran long. He nodded, swallowed the question rising in his throat, and watched her set her purse down on the counter, like nothing inside it could detonate a life. She excused herself to the bathroom. The door closed, water ran, his pulse climbed. From the living room, he listened for sounds, for anything out of place, then silence, long enough to hurt. When she came back, her face was composed, but something had shifted. Not guilt exactly, calculation. They ate dinner, talking about harmless things, a neighbor's new dog, a show they might watch, plans for the weekend. All the while, his chest felt packed with glass. Finally, she reached for her purse, fingers hesitating just before dipping inside. He held his breath. She froze. It lasted less than a second. But he saw it, the pause, the sharp inhale. Her hand tightened around something, before she withdrew it and closed the purse again. She didn't look at him. She didn't say a word. Instead, she stood, walked to the sink, and began washing dishes that were already clean. That was the moment he knew he wasn't imagining things. Over the next few days, he became a quiet archivist of her life. He memorized schedules, noted patterns, counted the minutes between text messages and replies. He hated himself for it, hated the way suspicion hollowed him out, but the alternative blind faith felt worse. Faith, he was learning, it could be weaponized. She started dressing differently, nothing extreme, just more effort, a new perfume he didn't recognize. When he complimented her, she smiled, thanked him, and changed the subject. When he asked about her day, she gave summaries instead of stories. One night, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The preview glowed just long enough for him to see a name he didn't recognize and a message that read, Can't stop thinking about last time. He felt something tear inside him, then not loudly. Not all at once, but like fabric giving way under steady pressure. Still, he waited. The unfairness of it gnawed at him. If he had made a mistake, if he had strayed, he would have been the villain without trial. But now, faced with her deception, he was expected to stay calm, to gather proof like a lawyer instead of bleeding like a husband. Betrayal, he realized, often demanded patience from the wounded and offered speed to the guilty. He followed her one evening under the excuse of a late workout. The sky was low and gray, the city humming with indifference. She didn't go to the office. She didn't go to the gym. She drove to a quiet part of town and parked near a small hotel with warm lights and tinted windows. He stopped across the street, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Watching her step out of the car with purpose, she didn't look back. He didn't follow her inside. He couldn't. Instead, he sat there until his phone buzzed with a message from her asking if he'd be home late. He stared at the screen, the lie unfolding in real time, and typed back, "Just leaving now." That night, she reached for him in bed. He let her, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to understand how someone could divide themselves so completely. As she slept afterward, he lay awake, staring into the dark, wondering how many versions of her existed and which one he had married. The next morning, he checked their bank account. Small withdrawals, carefully spaced, enough to fund secrecy without raising alarms. It wasn't impulsive, it was organized. The story was bigger than an affair. He began to see the outlines of something more deliberate. Meetings disguised as work, expenses justified as errands, even apologies deployed strategically, arriving just when suspicion might crest. She wasn't just lying, she was managing. And then came the email. No sender name, no greeting. Just a single line. If you want the truth, look closer at what you already replaced. His heart pounded as he read it again. The photo, the one now living where the condoms had been, he realized then that this wasn't just between him and his wife anymore. Someone else knew, someone else was watching. That realization changed him. Fear gave way to focus. Hurt sharpened into resolve. He printed copies of statements, saved screenshots, backed up files. He stopped asking questions and started building a timeline. Every secret, every omission, every suspicious coincidence found its place. When he finally confronted her, it wasn't with rage, it was with quiet clarity. She denied at first, then minimized, then cried. She admitted to meetings, but denied intimacy, claimed confusion, claimed pressure, claimed love. He listened, absorbing each word, weighing it against the evidence he already held. The truth, when it came, arrived crooked and incomplete, dragged into the light by exhaustion rather than honesty. She had been involved with someone connected to a financial deal she never told him about. A deal that required discretion, loyalty, silence. The condoms, she said, and were never meant for him to find. They were insurance against a life she didn't know how to escape. It was the explanation of someone who wanted absolution without accountability. He told her he needed time, space. She nodded, relieved by the delay, mistaking restraint for forgiveness. As he packed a bag that night, he glanced once more at their wedding photo. Two people smiling into a future that only one of them had truly committed to. He didn't tear it up. He didn't throw it away. He left it on the counter. Because the story wasn't over yet, he moved into a short-term apartment across town, the kind with neutral walls and furniture that felt borrowed from someone else's life. The silence there was different, thicker, more honest. No shared routines, no forced conversations, just time stretching wide enough for thoughts he had avoided for years. For the first few days, she called constantly. Then she switched to messages, then voice notes, her tone soft, careful, almost rehearsed. She spoke of confusion, of mistakes, of love that had lost its way. He listened to some, deleted others without opening them. Each message felt less like remorse and more like damage control. He kept working, but now, with a second job no one could see. At night, he spread papers across the kitchen table, bank statements, printed emails, screenshots of calendars that didn't align. Patterns emerged, money flowing out in amounts too small to trigger alerts, meetings scheduled under vague titles, names repeated in places they didn't belong. One name, in particular, refused to stay quiet. Victor. He wasn't just a colleague. He was connected to a private investment group that had quietly circled the company months earlier. The same months the withdrawals began. The same months her wardrobe changed. Her absences multiplied. Her patience with him thinned. He remembered the first time he'd met Victor at a company function. The man's handshake had lingered just a beat too long, his smile polite but assessing, like someone gauging the value of an object. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it felt like a prologue. The email haunted him. If you want the truth, look closer at what you already replaced. He opened the digital copy of their wedding photo on his laptop and zoomed in slowly, methodically. Faces, smiles, guests blurred in the background. Then, at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by a pillar, a familiar posture. A man watching, not smiling, eyes fixed on the bride. Victor had been there. The realization made his stomach drop. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't recent. Whatever had happened hadn't begun months ago. It had roots. Long ones. He confronted her again, this time with questions sharpened by facts. Where had she met Victor first? Why had she never mentioned his presence at the wedding? Why had she signed documents she couldn't explain? She hesitated, calculating which truths could survive daylight. She admitted Victor had approached her, before the wedding, offering help when her family was drowning in debt she had never told her fiancé about. Medical bills, old loans, threats that came wrapped in polite language. Victor had promised solutions in exchange for flexibility, access, silence. She claimed she'd believed she could manage it without crossing lines that mattered, that she could protect both worlds, that the affair wasn't supposed to happen. He didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort her. He noticed the way she framed herself as the center of tragedy, the victim of circumstances, the heroine of her own excuse. He asked one question when she finished. Why the condoms? She looked away. Because some lines, once crossed, don't uncross. He left again, this time with a plan. He hired a private investigator, recommended by a lawyer who specialized in financial misconduct. Everything was done cleanly, legally. No wiretaps, no hacking, just records, public filings, patterns of behavior that told stories when assembled correctly. The picture that formed was ugly and precise. Victor had a habit of identifying leverage people with quiet vulnerabilities, hidden debts, reputations to protect. He inserted himself as a solution, then tightened control until compliance felt like survival. He wasn't just sleeping with her. He was using her. And she had let him. The investigator found another name tied into the scheme. A mutual friend, someone who had vouched for Victor early on, someone who had downplayed concerns and encouraged trust. Betrayal, it seemed, liked to travel in pairs. When confronted, the friend tried to justify it as business, claimed no one had been forced, claimed everyone benefited. The words landed flat. There was no language that could make exploitation sound like opportunity. With evidence in hand, he went to authorities, not for revenge, but for resolution. The process was slow, methodical, unglamorous. Exactly the opposite of the damage it addressed. As the investigation unfolded, Victor's confidence cracked. Meetings were canceled, calls went unanswered, threats softened into negotiations, then into pleas. He tried reaching out through intermediaries, offering settlements, favors, silence bought with money. They were refused. She watched it all unravel from a distance, her own role shrinking as the truth expanded. She tried to stand beside him, to frame herself as an ally, now that the danger had a name. He didn't stop her from talking. He just didn't let her rewrite history. When Victor was finally charged, the relief wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, almost hollow. Justice didn't feel like winning. It felt like stopping the bleeding. The marriage ended without theatrics. No screaming matches, no courtroom spectacle, just signatures, divided assets, and a shared understanding that something essential had been broken long before the final blow. On his last visit to the house, he walked through rooms that still echoed with routines they'd once shared. He packed the rest of his things slowly. In the bedroom, he found the wedding photo she had returned to its frame. He took it down. He didn't destroy it. He placed it in a box with documents labeled closed. Healing didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as repetition. Therapy appointments, long walks, nights where sleep came without dreams, days where the weight lifted enough to breathe. He learned to trust his instincts again, to recognize discomfort as information, not weakness, to understand that love without honesty was just performance. Months later, in a cafe across town, he noticed a couple laughing over coffee. Nothing remarkable about them, except the ease between their silences. It struck him then, not with pain, but clarity that what he had lost was not love itself, but an illusion carefully maintained by fear, and illusions, once shattered, do not deserve mourning. He finished his drink, stood, and walked back into a life that was finally his own, no longer built on substitutions, secrets, or photographs meant to hide the truth. Time did not rush to meet him. It moved cautiously, as if unsure whether he was ready to be carried forward. Weeks passed, then months. The investigation faded from headlines. Victor's name replaced by newer scandals, but the residue of what had happened lingered in quieter ways. Certain songs still tightened his chest. Certain streets still pulled memories from hiding. Healing, he learned, was not a straight line. It doubled back when he least expected it. He stayed in therapy longer than he had planned. At first, he spoke about betrayal in careful, distant language, as if describing someone else's life. Gradually, the words changed. He spoke about shame, how he had ignored early discomfort because admitting it felt like admitting failure. He spoke about masculinity, about how being deceived had made him question his worth, his judgment, his identity. Saying those things out loud stripped them of their power. He rebuilt routines, morning runs along the river, cooking meals that were too elaborate for one person, calling friends he had quietly withdrawn from during the last year of his marriage. Some relationships resumed easily. Others remained awkward, strained by loyalty tests no one had known they were taking. One afternoon, a letter arrived, handwritten, careful. It was from her. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask to meet. She wrote about consequences, real ones, lost opportunities, legal expenses, therapy of her own. She admitted that fear had shaped her choices, long before Victor entered the picture. Fear of being exposed, fear of disappointing him, fear of losing the life she had carefully curated. She acknowledged that replacing truth with control had felt safer. Until it destroyed everything, he read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't respond. Not because he hated her, but because he no longer needed to be understood by her to move on. A year after the separation, he changed jobs, not out of necessity, but intention. The new role was quieter, less political, more aligned with the values he'd rediscovered. He found satisfaction in work that didn't demand moral compromise, that didn't reward silence over integrity. On weekends, he volunteered at a local mentorship program. He didn't tell his story. He didn't need to. Presence was enough. Listening was enough. He noticed how often people just needed someone to believe them before they believed themselves. One evening, after a long day, he found the old box labeled closed tucked away in a closet he rarely opened. He hesitated, then brought it out. Inside were documents, notes, and the wedding photo. He held it for a long moment. The image no longer hurt. It felt distant, like a still from a movie he'd once watched too many times. He saw now what he hadn't then, the tension in her smile. The way his own eyes searched for reassurance he already sensed was missing. He wasn't angry with that version of himself. He felt tenderness. He had done the best he could with the truth he had been given. He removed the photo from the frame and placed it back in the box. Then he took the box outside and set it beside the trash, paused, and finally let it go. Not dramatically, just deliberately. Later that night, he met friends for dinner. Laughter came easier now. Conversation flowed without the constant undercurrent of vigilance. He realized he hadn't checked his phone once to see if someone was lying to him. That freedom felt almost unfamiliar. As he walked home, the city lights reflected off wet pavement, blurring into something softer. He thought about how the story had begun with a small discovery that had shattered his assumptions. How unfair it had felt to be forced into the role of investigator in his own marriage. How lonely it had been to carry doubt without proof. He understood now that the injustice wasn't just the betrayal. It was the expectation that he should have accepted it quietly, that love required endurance of deception. He rejected that idea completely. Trust, he had learned, was not blind. It was built, maintained, protected by honesty, even when honesty was inconvenient or painful. At home, he opened a window and let the night air in. Somewhere below, someone laughed. Somewhere else, someone argued. Life, unbothered by personal tragedies, continued at its own pace. That realization no longer felt cruel. It felt comforting. He made tea and sat by the window, watching the city settle. For the first time in a long while, his thoughts didn't spiral backward. They rested in the present, unafraid of what they might uncover. The story that began with replacement, with a photograph standing in for something hidden, ended not with revenge, but with clarity. He hadn't won by exposing others. He had won by refusing to lose himself. And that, he knew, was the kind of ending no one could take away. The quiet didn't last forever. It never does. Just when his life began to feel solid again, when mornings no longer started with suspicion and nights no longer ended with replayed conversations, the past knocked softly, disguised as coincidence. It started with a phone call from an unfamiliar number. He let it ring out, then a voicemail appeared, short and formal, asking him to return the call regarding a matter connected to a previous case. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with annoyance. He had earned his distance. Still, curiosity won. The call came from a junior attorney, working under the prosecutor, who had handled Victor's case. New evidence had surfaced. Not about Victor himself, that chapter was closed, but about others who had benefited quietly from the same web of manipulation. Names that hadn't made headlines. Names that had slipped through because they were careful, indirect, useful. One of those names, the attorney said, had appeared repeatedly in financial records linked to his former marital accounts. He ended the call, staring at the wall, the familiar weight pressing gently but insistently against his ribs. He had thought the damage was contained. He had thought the story had resolved itself into something finite. Instead, it was expanding again, asking him to look where he had already decided not to. That night, he dreamed of the wedding, not the ceremony itself, but the reception afterward, people milling about, conversations overlapping, laughter sharp and hollow. He searched the room for her. But every face turned into someone else. He woke before he found her. The following week, he met with the attorney. This time, the meeting felt different. Not urgent, procedural, the tone of people who dealt in aftermaths rather than crises. They showed him charts, timelines, connections that extended beyond Victor's immediate circle, small consulting fees, loans disguised as favors, transactions routed through accounts that had once been joint. His name was nowhere on the documents, but his proximity had been exploited. His stability had been used as camouflage. He felt anger rise, clean and focused. Not the raw kind that demanded destruction, but the kind that demanded acknowledgement, He agreed to cooperate, not because he owed anyone anything, but because he refused to let silence continue doing harm. As the inquiry moved forward, he was careful about how much space it occupied in his life. He didn't let it consume him the way the first unraveling had. He had learned boundaries, learned when to engage and when to step back. That was its own form of progress. She reached out again during that time, not with apologies this time, but with information. She had been contacted too. She claimed she wanted to help. He listened, asked precise questions, verified everything independently. Trust, once broken, did not regenerate simply because circumstances aligned. Still, he saw something different in her now. Not remorse as performance, but fatigue, the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long balancing lies and finally felt the cost in her bones. It didn't soften his stance, but it clarified the distance between them. They were no longer enemies. They were simply people who could not walk the same road. The investigation concluded quietly. No dramatic arrests, no public reckoning, just amended records, recovered funds, and a few careers quietly redirected. Accountability, he learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it was administrative, and sometimes that was enough. With that final thread tied off, something inside him settled completely for the first time. He took a short trip alone afterward, driving without a destination, stopping when the road suggested it. He stayed in small towns, ate at diners where no one knew his name, listened to conversations that had nothing to do with his history. There was relief in anonymity, in being just another person passing through. On one of those evenings, sitting on a motel balcony with a cup of bad coffee, he thought about the moment everything had changed, how a small discovery had detonated a life he thought he understood, how unfair it had been to carry the burden of truth while everyone else continued as if nothing was wrong. But he also thought about what that moment had given him: clarity, agency, the refusal to accept a version of love that required self-erasure. He realized then that the photograph, the one that had started it all, had never really been about exposure. It had been about memory, about forcing the present to confront the past it was betraying. In replacing one object with another, he had reminded himself of who he had been before compromise crept in quietly. When he returned home, he made changes he had been postponing, rearranged furniture, donated clothes that no longer felt like his, painted a wall simply because he wanted to choose a color without negotiation. Each decision, small and mundane, reinforced the same truth: his life was his again. One evening, while sorting through old emails for work, he came across an unsent draft from years earlier, a note he had started writing to himself on the morning of his wedding, meant to capture how he felt before everything became official. He had forgotten it existed. He read it slowly. It spoke of hope, of commitment grounded in honesty, of a desire to build something that didn't require masks. The words were earnest, unguarded. He felt no embarrassment reading them, only respect for the person who had written them. He saved the file under a new name and closed his laptop. The story that had once felt like a wound now felt like a scar, evidence of damage. Yes, but also of survival. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't regret it either. It had shaped him, sharpened him, taught him where he ended and where others began. As he turned off the lights that night, he understood something that had taken a long time to learn. Healing wasn't about reclaiming what was lost. It was about refusing to replace yourself again for anyone who asked you to disappear quietly. And this time, the quiet felt earned. The seasons shifted without asking his permission. Summer leaned into fall, and with it came a rhythm he hadn't felt in years, one that didn't revolve around vigilance or recovery, but presence. He woke early now, not from anxiety, but habit. Mornings belonged to him. Coffee tasted stronger. Silence felt less like a threat and more like a companion. Yet, even as life steadied, he knew better than to believe the past was finished teaching him. Healing, he had learned, didn't end when pain faded. It deepened when patterns became visible. It happened one evening while he was grocery shopping. A simple errand. He stood in line, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone. When a familiar laugh cut through the noise, he didn't turn immediately. Some instincts never quite relax. When he did look up, he saw her across the aisle, holding a basket, talking animatedly to a woman he didn't recognize. She looked different, not dramatically, just lighter, as if the constant tension she once carried had finally loosened its grip. For a moment, he considered slipping away unnoticed. He could. There was no obligation left between them, but she saw him first. The recognition flickered across her face, followed by something like relief. She excused herself from her companion and approached slowly, as if afraid of startling him. They exchanged pleasantries. Neutral ones, the weather, work. How strange it was to run into each other like this. She didn't reach for him, didn't apologize, didn't explain. For the first time, she spoke to him without an agenda. She told him she was in therapy, that she had moved, that she was learning to sit with discomfort instead of trying to control it. He listened, noticing how her words no longer sought approval. They simply existed. When they parted, there was no dramatic closure, just a quiet acknowledgement that the chapter had ended, and neither of them needed to reopen it to prove anything. As he walked home, bags cutting into his palms, he realized the encounter hadn't unsettled him. It had clarified something. He no longer measured his progress by how little she affected him. He measured it by how fully he inhabited his own life afterward. Weeks later, an opportunity arose at work, one that would have required compromise, strategic silence, alignment with people who blurred ethical lines for convenience. Months ago, he might have considered it, rationalized the trade-offs. Now, the answer came easily. He declined. The decision surprised his colleagues. It surprised him too, in the best way. He hadn't needed to justify it to himself. He simply knew what kind of life he was no longer willing to build. He started dating again, slowly, carefully. Not because he felt incomplete alone, but because curiosity had returned. Some connections fizzled, others lingered briefly. One, in particular, unfolded with unexpected gentleness. No fireworks, no urgency, just shared meals, long conversations, and an ease that didn't demand explanation. He paid attention to how it felt to trust without scanning for danger, to speak honestly without calculating consequences, to disagree without fear of abandonment. These were small miracles, easily overlooked by those who had never lost them. One night, after dinner, he found himself telling part of his story. Not the details, just the shape of it. The way love had once asked him to ignore himself. The way he had learned not to comply. She listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything. When he finished, she said simply, "That sounds like it hurt." It did, and it had. But hearing it acknowledged without judgment felt like something settling into place. As the year closed, he reflected on how much had changed since that first discovery, how a single object had cracked open a narrative he'd accepted too easily, how replacing it with something symbolic had been less about revenge and more about refusing to participate in denial. He thought about injustice, not just the kind imposed by others, but the kind people inflict on themselves when they stay quiet to preserve appearances. He had done that once. He would not do it again. On the anniversary of the day he moved out, he took a long walk through the city. He passed familiar corners without flinching. He noticed new ones he'd never explored. The city hadn't changed. He had. He sat on a bench as dusk settled, watching strangers pass, each carrying private worlds no one else could see. He wondered how many of them were holding truths they were afraid to name. How many were waiting for permission to trust themselves? He wished, briefly, that he could tell them what he had learned, that the cost of silence always exceeded the cost of honesty, that dignity was not something others granted, it was something you chose, again and again, even when it hurt. As night fell, he headed home, feeling something close to gratitude. Not for the betrayal, not for the loss, but for the clarity that followed, for the version of himself that had emerged intact, more discerning, less willing to disappear for the comfort of others. The story that began with suspicion ended with self-respect. And that, he knew, was not an ending at all, but a foundation. He unlocked his door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind him, no longer shutting anything out, but finally letting himself in. The following months carried a different kind of weight, not heavy, but deliberate. Life no longer felt like something happening to him. It felt like something he was choosing, piece by piece, with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. He noticed it first in the way he listened. Conversations no longer ran in the background, while his mind searched for subtext. When someone spoke, he stayed with their words instead of bracing for what might be hidden underneath. That alone felt like a quiet victory. Work settled into a steady cadence. He became known as someone reliable, not because he absorbed chaos, but because he addressed problems plainly. He asked uncomfortable questions early. He documented decisions. He refused vague assurances. Some people found it abrasive. Others found it refreshing. He no longer needed universal approval. The woman he'd been seeing remained part of his life, but neither of them rushed to define it. They shared space without ownership, time without expectation. He appreciated how she didn't confuse intensity with intimacy. When disagreements surfaced, they didn't escalate into power struggles. They paused, talked, adjusted. It felt unfamiliar in the best way. One evening, after a long walk, she asked him something simple that caught him off guard. "What scared you the most back then?" He didn't answer immediately. The old version of him would have deflected with humor or abstraction. Instead, he considered it honestly. "That I'd stop trusting myself," he said. "That I'd explain away what I felt just to keep the story intact." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. That moment stayed with him long after she left for the night. It clarified something essential. Betrayal hadn't just threatened his relationship, it had threatened his internal compass. Rebuilding that trust had been the real work. He started writing again, something he hadn't done since college. Not for publication, not even consistently. Just fragments, observations, questions he wished he'd asked sooner, patterns he recognized in himself and others. The act of putting thoughts into words grounded him. It made the abstract tangible. Occasionally, memories surfaced uninvited. A restaurant they used to love, a song from a road trip. These moments no longer dragged him backward. They passed through him like weather noticed. Acknowledged, then gone. On one such afternoon, while sorting through old digital files, he found a folder he didn't remember creating. Inside were drafts, notes, timelines from the investigation period, evidence of a version of himself operating under pressure, fueled by fear and resolve. He didn't feel embarrassed reading them. He felt respect. That version of him had stepped forward when needed, had refused to look away, had protected his future, even when it cost his present. He archived the folder and labeled it simply, Proof. Later that week, he received an unexpected invitation. A mutual acquaintance from his past, someone who had distanced themselves quietly during the unraveling, was hosting a small gathering. The message was tentative, as if unsure whether to reach out at all. He debated declining, then decided to go. The gathering was unremarkable in the best way. Casual conversation, laughter that didn't demand anything. At one point, the acquaintance pulled him aside and apologized, not dramatically, but sincerely, admitted they hadn't known how to show up when things became complicated. That fear had guided their absence. He accepted the apology without ceremony, not because it erased anything, but because he no longer needed others to behave perfectly to feel whole. As the night wound down, someone mentioned his past marriage in passing, then quickly changed the subject, clearly uncomfortable. He didn't stop them. He didn't correct the narrative. He didn't feel the urge to explain himself. His story no longer required defense. The realization surprised him with its simplicity. Weeks later, he took a day off and drove out of the city. following roads that narrowed into quiet stretches bordered by trees. He parked near a trailhead and walked until his phone lost signal. The air smelled clean, unburdened. Sitting on a fallen log, he thought about the moment he had chosen to replace one object with another, how instinctive it had been, how symbolic. At the time, he hadn't known what he was setting in motion. He had only known he refused to collude with a lie. That instinct to interrupt denial had guided everything that followed. He understood now that healing wasn't passive. It wasn't waiting for time to dull pain. It was active participation in truth, even when truth disrupted comfort, especially then. As dusk approached, he returned to his car and headed home, feeling grounded in a way that didn't rely on circumstance. Whatever came next, joy, loss, uncertainty, he trusted himself to meet it honestly. That trust had been hard-won. Back in the city, life continued its steady rhythm. Plans formed, seasons turned. The future no longer appeared as something fragile he needed to protect at all costs. It appeared flexible, responsive, shaped by choices rather than fear. He cooked dinner that night and ate by the window, watching lights come on across the street. Somewhere nearby, a couple argued softly. Somewhere else, someone laughed too loudly. Stories unfolded everywhere, unseen and unresolved. He felt no urge to intervene, to compare, to measure his own against theirs. When he went to bed, he slept deeply, without the restless edge that had once defined his nights. There were no dreams of replacement, no echoes of suspicion, just rest, and in that rest was the quiet certainty that he had crossed something irreversible, not into bitterness, not into cynicism, but into clarity. The kind that stays. Clarity, he discovered, didn't mean certainty. It meant resilience in the absence of it. Life still presented unanswered questions, still delivered moments that felt unsteady. But he no longer mistook discomfort for danger. That distinction changed everything. The relationship he was building unfolded slowly, without the urgency that once would have made him anxious. They didn't fill silence just to avoid it. They allowed space to exist, trusting that connection didn't dissolve simply because words paused. On weekends, they cooked together, sometimes burning food, sometimes getting it just right. The outcome mattered less than the ease of the process. One afternoon, while sorting through old books, he found a journal he hadn't opened in years. It belonged to a version of himself who believed writing could organize chaos. He flipped through pages filled with neat handwriting and unfinished thoughts near the end. There was an entry dated just weeks before the wedding. It spoke about hope, but also fear, about the pressure to be chosen, to be enough, to keep things intact at all costs. Reading it now, he recognized the warning signs he had ignored, not because he was foolish, but because he had been afraid to trust intuition when it contradicted narrative. He closed the journal gently, feeling neither regret nor shame. Awareness, even delayed, still counted. At work, a junior colleague sought his advice after uncovering inconsistencies in a project led by someone more senior. The concern was valid but risky to voice. He listened carefully, hearing echoes of his own past hesitation. Instead of offering platitudes, he helped map out a path that prioritized documentation and transparency. He didn't promise protection, he promised honesty. The project was reviewed, adjustments were made. No one was publicly shamed, but accountability shifted the culture slightly. It was subtle, but meaningful. He saw how truth could be introduced without theatrics, how integrity didn't require confrontation to be effective. That evening, he reflected on how often people confused peace with avoidance. How many relationships, careers, and identities were built on not asking the wrong questions. He had lived that reality. He had paid for it. He wouldn't pass it on. He received a message from his former friend, the one who had enabled Victor quietly. It was brief, apologetic, but defensive, a mixture of regret and justification that stopped short of full ownership. He read it once and didn't respond. Some conversations existed only to reopen wounds that no longer needed air. Instead, he went for a run. The city was alive in its usual way. Traffic humming, people moving with purpose. His body found a rhythm that matched his breath. Each step felt like affirmation. He wasn't outrunning anything. He was moving with himself. Later that night, sitting across from the woman he was seeing, he told her about the message. Not to seek reassurance, but to share reality. She listened, asked a question or two, then changed the subject naturally, signaling trust without fixation. He appreciated that more than she could know. As months passed, invitations came and went. Weddings, birthdays, housewarmings. He attended some, declined others. Choice had become his compass. He no longer agreed out of obligation or fear of exclusion. Presence meant intention now. At one gathering, someone who knew parts of his story asked quietly how he managed to move on so well. The phrasing struck him, as if moving on were a destination reached by effort alone. "I didn't move on," he said after a moment. "I moved forward. There's a difference." That night, lying awake, he considered how language shaped understanding, how calling something betrayal framed it as an act done to him, while recognizing the patterns beneath it revealed something more complex. He hadn't been targeted because he was weak. He had been chosen because he was stable, predictable, trusting. He resolved to keep those qualities without letting them be exploited again. One weekend, he and his partner took a short trip out of town. Nothing elaborate, just a cabin, trees, and a lack of schedule. On the second morning, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching fog lift slowly from the ground. She reached for his hand without ceremony. He felt no rush of adrenaline, no fear of loss, just presence. "I feel safe with you," she said casually, as if stating a preference rather than a confession. The words landed softly but firmly. Safety, he realized, wasn't about control or certainty. It was about consistency, about knowing that truth would be met with curiosity rather than punishment. He thought back to the moment he had found the condoms, the shock, the injustice, the way silence had seemed like the only acceptable response at first, how quickly love had been reframed as endurance. He would never confuse those things again. As the year drew to a close, he reviewed goals he'd set months earlier. Not resolutions, but intentions. Speak sooner. Leave when values are compromised. Don't replace yourself to preserve an image. He had followed them imperfectly, but consistently. On the final evening of the year, he stood by the window, watching fireworks bloom across the skyline. Each burst faded quickly, replaced by another, until the sky returned to dark. He didn't feel the urge to mark the moment with declarations. The significance was internal, steady. He sent a brief message to a friend who had supported him quietly throughout the worst of it. A simple thank you, gratitude, he had learned, didn't need elaboration. When midnight passed, nothing dramatic shifted, and that felt right. The story that began with substitution, with an object replaced to expose a truth, had taught him something enduring. You could interrupt a lie without becoming consumed by it. You could demand honesty without sacrificing compassion. You could walk away without disappearing. As he turned away from the window and joined the woman waiting for him in the living room, he felt aligned in a way he hadn't before. Not fixed, not finished, but grounded. Whatever came next, he would meet it without replacing himself again. And that knowledge, quiet and unremarkable as it seemed, was the most powerful ending he could have imagined. The next chapter of his life didn't announce itself with conflict or revelation. It arrived through repetition, small choices reinforced daily, until they hardened into character. He noticed it in how he handled disappointment. A canceled plan no longer felt like rejection. A delayed response didn't spiral into suspicion. His nervous system, once trained to anticipate rupture, was relearning neutrality. That shift became apparent when something genuinely uncertain appeared. The woman he had been seeing received an offer to relocate for work, not permanently, but long enough to introduce questions neither of them could answer easily. She brought it up one evening without ceremony, her tone open, unguarded. He felt the old reflex stir the urge to secure, define, preempt loss. He recognized it immediately and let it pass. They talked, not in circles, not with ultimatums. They mapped possibilities and limits. They acknowledged fear without allowing it to dominate the conversation. When the night ended, nothing was decided, and that was acceptable. The absence of resolution no longer felt like danger. After she left, he sat alone and reflected on how different this moment felt from similar ones in his past. Before, uncertainty would have triggered bargaining promises made prematurely. Boundaries softened to keep proximity intact. Now, he trusted that clarity would emerge without coercion. That trust was new and fragile and real. At work, he was asked to mentor a new hire who struggled with confidence. The role surprised him. He hadn't considered himself someone others might look to for guidance. During their meetings, he noticed how often the conversation drifted toward validation rather than skill. The new hire wanted assurance they weren't failing. He recognized the pattern. Instead of reassurance, he offered perspective, progress over perfection, curiosity over fear. He shared mistakes without dramatizing them. He watched as the tension eased, replaced by focus. Teaching, he realized, reinforced what he had learned more effectively than reflection alone. One evening, sorting through old belongings, he found a small envelope tucked into a book. Inside was a handwritten note from his former self, something he had written during the investigation period but never finished. It was addressed to no one, just a question written repeatedly in different phrasing. What do you do when love asks you to disappear? He read it slowly, then once more. The answer felt obvious now. You leave. Or, you change the terms. You do not comply. He folded the note and placed it back, not as a relic of pain, but as a marker of evolution. He didn't need to destroy it to move forward. He didn't need to keep it visible either. Its lesson had been integrated. The relocation decision unfolded naturally. She accepted the offer with a clear timeline and boundaries. They agreed to continue seeing each other without dramatizing distance. If it worked, it worked. If it didn't, neither would contort themselves to preserve something that no longer fit. The goodbye at the airport was unremarkable. A long hug. A smile that carried both hope and realism. He watched her disappear into the crowd without feeling hollow. That surprised him more than anything else. Weeks passed. Communication remained consistent but unforced. Sometimes they spoke daily. Sometimes several days passed without contact. He noticed how peace persisted regardless. Attachment had softened into choice. In that space, other parts of his life expanded. He joined a climbing gym on a whim, drawn more by curiosity than ambition. The physical challenge demanded presence. There was no room for rumination when grip and balance determined the next move. Progress came slowly. Falls were frequent. No one judged. That environment, built on trust and failure, it felt quietly healing. One afternoon, while resting between climbs, he overheard a conversation nearby. Someone joked about ignoring red flags early in a relationship because love is supposed to be hard. The phrase stuck with him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He simply noted how easily suffering was still romanticized. Later that evening, he wrote the phrase down and crossed it out. Love wasn't supposed to be hard. Growth was. Honesty was. But love, real love, made those things possible without requiring erasure. The investigation that once dominated his thoughts had faded into memory, but its lessons remained active. He noticed manipulation more easily now, not just in others, but in systems, narratives, expectations. He learned to disengage without disengaging from himself. One day, an unfamiliar message arrived through a professional network. Someone referenced his handling of a past situation and asked for advice regarding a complicated partnership. The tone was cautious, respectful. He agreed to a call. They spoke for an hour. He didn't offer solutions. He asked questions. He listened for what was being avoided. When the call ended, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not pride, alignment. He had used his experience without being consumed by it. As winter approached, he hosted a small gathering at his place. Friends old and new filled the room. Music played softly. Food ran out too quickly. Someone spilled wine and laughed. At one point, he caught himself observing the scene from a distance, waiting for tension that never came. He smiled at the realization. Late that night, after everyone left, he cleaned up slowly. In the quiet, he considered how much his internal world had changed. The vigilance had dissolved. The urge to manage outcomes had softened. He no longer needed to replace objects, to reveal truths. He trusted himself to see them directly. Before bed, he checked his phone. A message from her waited. A photo of a quiet street where she now lived. A caption, "Learning the neighborhood." He typed back, "Looks like a good place to learn." He set the phone down without checking for a response. Sleep came easily. The story that once unfolded like a thriller marked by secrecy, injustice, and sudden revelation had settled into something steadier. Not an epilogue, not a moral victory. A life recalibrated. He didn't know exactly where it was going, and for the first time, that uncertainty felt honest rather than threatening. He closed his eyes, grounded in the knowledge that whatever came next, he would not trade his presence for proximity again. Winter settled in quietly, coating the city in a dull patience that felt almost instructive. The cold forced people inward into cafes, into conversations, into themselves. He found that he didn't resist it. Slower days suited him now. They left room to notice what remained. When urgency faded, communication with her evolved into something lighter. They shared observations instead of assurances, photos of meals, brief notes about strange encounters, fragments of days that didn't need interpretation. When weeks passed without seeing each other, he didn't mark the absence as loss. It felt more like a pause that carried its own integrity. During one of their calls, she mentioned a challenge at work, a subtle pressure to compromise on reporting numbers. Nothing overt, just industry normal. She laughed it off at first, but he heard the tension beneath it. He asked questions without directing her. What did it cost? Who benefited? What would silence require of her later? She went quiet, then thanked him, not for advice, but for the questions. When they hung up, he recognized the familiar shape of that moment. Truth emerging not through confrontation, but through space. He noticed how often people needed permission to trust their discomfort, how easily they dismissed it as overthinking. He had done the same once, mistaking unease for insecurity. Now he recognized it as data. At work, a restructuring announcement arrived unexpectedly. Teams were merged, leadership shifted, uncertainty rippled through the office. He watched reactions with interest. Some people postured, others retreated. He focused on clarity. He asked how decisions would be evaluated, what metrics mattered, what timelines existed. The answers weren't perfect, but they were concrete. That was enough. A colleague pulled him aside later and said, half joking, "You're strangely calm about all this." He smiled. Calm wasn't absence of concern. It was confidence in his ability to respond without betraying himself. On a snowy afternoon, he received a message from his former friend again. This time it was different, shorter, unguarded. An acknowledgement without qualifiers. An admission of fear. No request for reconciliation, just ownership. He sat with it for a long while. Forgiveness didn't rush forward. Neither did resentment. He replied simply, "I appreciate the honesty. Take care." It wasn't closure. It was containment. That evening, he walked through the neighborhood, snow crunching underfoot, breath visible in the air. Windows glowed warmly as families gathered inside. He felt neither excluded nor longing. He felt present. He thought about how often injustice had asked him to be patient in the past, patient with lies, with omissions, with stories that protected others at his expense. He had mistaken patience for virtue. He knew better now. Patience was only virtuous when it wasn't demanded by fear. Back home, he made dinner and played music softly. He caught himself humming along, a habit he hadn't noticed returning. Small signs mattered. A few days later, she visited unexpectedly. Not a surprise she'd told him she'd be in town, but the timing felt organic rather than planned. They hugged, lingering, just long enough to acknowledge familiarity without clinging to it. They spent the day wandering, stopping for coffee, ducking into shops to escape the cold. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences. At one point, she asked him if he ever regretted how things had ended. He considered it carefully. "I regret that it took pain to learn what I needed," he said. "But I don't regret choosing myself when it mattered." She nodded, eyes steady. "I'm trying to learn that too." They didn't dissect the past. They didn't promise the future. They let the day be enough. That night, after she left, he reflected on how different intimacy felt now. Less consuming, more reciprocal, no one performing a role. No one asking the other to disappear quietly. As the year edged closer to its end, he found himself revisiting the idea of home. Not as a place, but as a state. He had moved apartments twice since the separation, each time carrying less with him. Objects mattered less than alignment. He arranged his space with intention. Books he returned to, photos that reflected who he was becoming, not who he had been. One evening, while organizing a shelf, he found the journal again. He opened to a blank page and wrote without planning. Not about betrayal, not about recovery. He wrote about choice, about the difference between love that contracts and love that expands, about the courage required to stop negotiating with your own discomfort. He closed the journal and placed it back, feeling finished with it for now. At a small holiday gathering, someone asked him what had changed most over the past year. The question surprised him. He scanned his internal landscape, searching for a concise answer. "I stopped confusing intensity with truth," he said finally. The room went quiet for a beat, then conversation resumed, but the sentence stayed with him. It felt accurate, earned. On the final night of the year, he sat alone by the window again, watching snow fall in slow, deliberate patterns. His phone buzzed once, a simple message wishing him well. He replied in kind and set it aside. He thought about the beginning of this story, how it had started with a discovery that felt humiliating, unjust, destabilizing, how replacing one object with another had been an act of defiance disguised as symbolism. He hadn't known then that he was setting a boundary with himself. No more substitutions. No more silent bargains. No more loyalty to stories that required self-erasure. As midnight approached, he didn't count down. He let the moment pass unmarked, trusting that meaning didn't require spectacle. When the clock turned, nothing dramatic happened, and everything had already changed. He turned off the lights, went to bed, and slept deeply, honestly carrying into the new year a steadiness that no longer depended on certainty, but on self-trust, and that trust, he knew, was the most enduring resolution of all. Spring arrived without ceremony, melting winter's restraint into something tentative and green. He felt it in his body. First the urge to open windows, to walk longer routes home, to say yes to invitations that once felt like obligations. The city loosened, and so did he. The restructuring at work finalized, and with it came a choice. He was offered a leadership role that would place him closer to decision-making, closer to the friction he had once avoided. The position came with influence and visibility. He took time to consider it, not out of fear, but discernment. Influence could be used to clarify or to obscure. He knew which mattered to him now. He accepted, with conditions, clear reporting lines, documented processes, a commitment to transparency that wasn't performative. Some of those conditions surprised his superiors. A few were negotiated. None were dismissed outright. The agreement felt less like a promotion and more like alignment. As weeks passed, he noticed how often people tested boundaries simply to see if they existed. When he held them calmly, without defensiveness, the testing stopped. Authority, he learned, wasn't about force, it was about consistency. Outside of work, the relationship he'd been nurturing continued to breathe on its own terms. They spent time together when schedules aligned and let distance exist when they didn't. When they disagreed, they didn't weaponize vulnerability. They named needs plainly, then listened. It was not perfect. It was honest. One afternoon, sitting on a park bench as children played nearby, she asked him whether he ever worried about repeating the past. The question wasn't accusatory. It was curious. Only if I stop paying attention, he said. Patterns don't repeat unless we invite them. She smiled at that, thoughtful. I'm trying to learn how to notice sooner, she said. Before I start explaining things away, he nodded. That impulse to explain discomfort instead of honoring it was familiar. It felt almost universal. Later that week, he received an invitation to speak at a small internal forum about ethical decision-making. The request surprised him. He hadn't positioned himself as an advocate. He had simply lived his values out loud. He agreed, not to lecture, but to share. When the day came, he spoke plainly. He didn't tell his story in detail. He didn't name villains. He talked about the cost of silence, about how organizations, like relationships, eroded when people learned to tolerate what they should have questioned. He watched faces shift as recognition landed quietly. Afterward, several people approached him, not with praise, but with questions. How to push back without burning bridges. How to speak up when power dynamics felt uneven. He answered carefully. There were no formulas, only principles. That evening, walking home, he felt a sense of continuity he hadn't expected. The skills he'd developed through personal upheaval were translating outward, creating ripples beyond his private life. Pain, once integrated, had become perspective. He thought about injustice again, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, corrosive variety that thrived on compliance. He had once participated in it unknowingly. He refused to do so again. The past tested him once more when an old mutual acquaintance reached out, hoping to reconnect socially. The message was friendly, casual, carefully neutral. He recognized the subtext: curiosity, maybe gossip, maybe reconciliation by proximity. He declined politely. Not with resentment, with clarity. Some connections belonged to a version of him that no longer existed. That night, he cooked dinner and ate alone. Content, solitude no longer felt like waiting. It felt like presence without performance. A few days later, she told him she was considering a longer-term move back. The opportunity that had taken her away was concluding, and options were opening. She didn't frame it as a decision they needed to make together. She simply shared it. He felt warmth at the thought, not urgency. Whatever you choose, he said, I want it to be because it fits your life, not because it stabilizes mine. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. That's why this feels different, she said. He understood. Love that didn't ask for sacrifice of self created room for choice. As the months unfolded, his routine solidified. Morning walks, writing in short bursts, dinners with friends who met him where he was, not where he'd been. He felt grounded in a way that didn't rely on certainty or control. One evening, while cleaning out a drawer, he found a small envelope he had overlooked. Inside was a duplicate of the wedding photo he'd once replaced in a purse, a copy he had kept without realizing it. He studied it calmly. The image no longer held power over him. It felt like a document evidence of a life stage, not a verdict. He placed it back in the envelope and wrote a date on the front. Then he tucked it into a box labeled Archive. Memory, he decided. He didn't need to be erased to lose its grip. It needed context. On a warm night near the end of spring, he hosted friends on his balcony. Laughter drifted upward, mingling with city sounds. Someone asked him if he ever thought about how differently things might have turned out if he'd confronted the truth immediately. Without replacing anything, without waiting, he considered it, then shook his head. "I think I did what I needed to do to see clearly," he said. "Timing matters, so does readiness." Later, after everyone left, he stood alone under the open sky, feeling the weight of the season settle comfortably on his shoulders. The story that had begun with shock and injustice had evolved into something quieter, sturdier. He hadn't become harder, he had become more precise. As he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from her, sharing a small victory from her day. He replied with encouragement, then set the phone aside without anticipation or anxiety. Sleep came easily, and in that ease was the final proof that the past no longer governed the present, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been understood, integrated, and released. The man who once replaced an object to expose a lie now lived in a life that required no substitutions at all. The promotion settled into his life like a new posture, slightly unfamiliar at first, then natural. Meetings moved differently when he spoke. Decisions paused. Questions were asked sooner. He noticed how often clarity changed the temperature of a room. It didn't eliminate disagreement. It made disagreement useful. He learned to recognize the moment when people expected him to soften a boundary for convenience. The pause before a request. The phrasing that framed compromise as cooperation. He answered with calm specificity. What was needed? What wasn't? Why? The effect was subtle, but cumulative. Over time, fewer people tried to bend the edges. They understood where he stood, outside the office. Life continued to expand in ordinary ways. He and the woman he cared for began spending more time together, not because they decided to, but because it felt right. She moved back into the city gradually, splitting time between places, as she closed one chapter and opened another. They didn't mark the transition with declarations. They let it become true through repetition. One evening, as they cooked dinner, she asked him whether he ever missed the certainty of his old life, the shared plans, the predictable milestones, the structure that came with believing the future was already mapped. The question wasn't nostalgia, it was curiosity. "I miss the simplicity," he said after a moment. "Not the certainty. Simplicity felt safe because I wasn't questioning anything, but it wasn't honest." She nodded, stirring a pot that needed more attention than either of them had given it. "Honest is messier," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but it holds." That distinction had become central to how he lived. He no longer equated comfort with truth. He had learned that comfort often arrived first, to distract from questions that needed asking. A few weeks later, an issue surfaced at work that tested that understanding. A long-standing partner organization had been quietly inflating outcomes. Nothing illegal on paper, but misleading enough to erode trust if discovered. The pressure to overlook it came wrapped in familiar language: relationships, history, mutual benefit. He requested a review, not publicly, not punitively, thoroughly. When the findings were presented, the room fell into an uneasy quiet. Some people expected him to soften the conclusion. He didn't. He proposed a corrective plan that protected stakeholders and preserved integrity. The partnership changed. Some bridges narrowed, others strengthened. Afterward, a senior colleague pulled him aside and said, "You're willing to be unpopular." He smiled slightly. "Only with systems that depend on silence." That night, he walked home under a sky heavy with humidity, feeling the quiet satisfaction of alignment. He wasn't chasing approval. He was building a life that could hold him without distortion. The past surfaced again in a quieter way when he received an invitation to a wedding someone he had known through his former marriage. The envelope sat unopened on his counter for days. He didn't dread it. He didn't feel obligated. He considered what attending would mean. He declined with a kind message, not because it would hurt, but because it would pull him into a narrative he no longer occupied. He understood now that closure didn't require participation. On a Sunday afternoon, he visited his parents. Over coffee, his mother mentioned how different he seemed, steadier, more present. She asked what had changed. He didn't recount the story. He didn't need to. "I learned to listen when something doesn't feel right," he said, "and to act before I start explaining it away." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. No more needed to be said. Later that week, while organizing files, he came across an email thread from the earliest days of the unraveling messages he had sent to himself, outlining facts, dates, patterns. He read them with the detachment of someone reviewing an old case. The urgency was palpable. The fear, too. But beneath it, there was resolve. He archived the thread and closed the folder. Proof had served its purpose. He continued writing, though the tone had shifted. Less analysis, more observation. He wrote about trust as an action, not a feeling. About boundaries as kindness clarified. About love as a space where truth didn't need translation. One evening, after a long day, he and his partner sat quietly on the couch, each absorbed in separate books. The silence was companionable. When she reached over and rested her head on his shoulder, it felt unremarkable in the best way. "I'm glad you didn't harden," she said suddenly, eyes still on the page. He thought about it, about how easily bitterness could have become armor, about how tempting it would have been to retreat into control or cynicism. "I was afraid of that," he admitted. But hardness felt like another kind of disappearance. She nodded, understanding without explanation. As summer deepened, he planned a short trip for himself. Alone, not to escape, but to check in. He chose a coastal town where mornings smelled like salt and evenings moved slowly. He walked along the water, letting thoughts rise and fall without chasing them. On the last night, sitting by the shore, he thought again about the beginning, how the discovery had felt like an indictment, how unfair it had been to lose certainty while others kept it. He recognized now that certainty had been borrowed, presence was earned. He returned home rested, not relieved. There was nothing to escape anymore. Life continued to offer choices, some easy, some not. He met each with the same principle. Do not replace yourself to preserve a story. If something requires silence to survive, let it change or let it go. One morning, as he prepared for work, he noticed the small, ordinary ways peace showed up now. The absence of rehearsal before conversations, the ease of saying no, the pleasure of saying yes without calculation. He understood then that the most dramatic part of his story had already passed, not the betrayal, not the investigation, but the moment he chose to trust his own perception over a convenient lie. That choice echoed quietly through everything that followed, and as he stepped into another day shaped by that echo, he felt grounded in a truth that no longer needed to be proven. He was no longer living in replacement. He was living in alignment. The coastal trip left a residue that stayed with him longer than the salt in his hair. It wasn't relaxation he brought back, but calibration. He returned to the city, noticing the difference between noise and signal, urgency and importance. The distinction guided his days, now, quietly but decisively. At work, the consequences of earlier decisions continued to unfold. The partner organization implemented the corrective plan with visible reluctance, and in the process, a few people opted out. New voices entered. The culture shifted by degrees, not declarations. He saw how systems responded when someone refused to trade clarity for comfort. They didn't collapse. They adapted. A junior manager approached him with a concern about an internal process that blurred accountability. The old him might have delayed, waiting for more evidence, more certainty. Now he asked for documentation and scheduled a review. The fix was simple once it was named. He wondered how many issues lingered only because no one wanted to be the first to point. Outside the office, the relationship deepened without accelerating. They talked about practical things, leases, schedules, finances, with the same care they used for feelings. There were disagreements. They didn't spiral, they learned each other's edges and adjusted without keeping score. He noticed how rarely he felt the need to perform reassurance. Trust showed up as reliability, not intensity. One evening, while cooking, she mentioned an old pattern she'd recognized in herself, the tendency to overfunction when anxious, to smooth things over before conflict had a chance to clarify. Saying it out loud seemed to relieve something. He recognized the pattern too, not as criticism, but as shared language. "I used to do the opposite," he said. "I underfunctioned. I waited. I hoped things would resolve themselves if I stayed agreeable." They laughed softly at the symmetry. Two different strategies born from the same fear. Naming them felt like disarming them. The past surfaced again when a former colleague reached out for a reference. The request was professional, neutral. He agreed to the call and prepared thoughtfully. During the conversation, it became clear the colleague wanted reassurance that certain past behaviors wouldn't be mentioned. He paused, then stated calmly what he could speak to and what he couldn't. The line held. The call ended politely. Afterward, he felt a familiar echo, how often boundaries were tested, not with confrontation, but with implication. He was no longer confused by it. He didn't personalize it. He simply responded. On a quiet weekend, he sorted through old photographs stored on a hard drive, not the wedding those had been archived, but everyday images, trips, meals, candid moments. He noticed how few of them captured genuine ease. Smiles were present, but something behind the eyes looked practiced. It wasn't an indictment. It was information he hadn't had access to then. He closed the folder and went for a walk, letting the city absorb the thought. Memory, he realized, matured with context. What once felt like loss now felt like data. As summer edged toward its end, he received an invitation to speak again, this time at a broader forum. He hesitated. Visibility carried responsibility. He accepted with a condition. The conversation would focus on process, not personality, principles, not confession. On the day of the talk, he spoke about alignment, the cost of misalignment in organizations and in lives. He didn't mention betrayal. He talked about substitution, how people replace truth with urgency, transparency with charm, accountability with intention. He watched the audience lean in, not because of drama, but recognition. Afterward, someone approached him quietly and said, "I needed to hear that. I've been explaining away something that doesn't sit right." He nodded. "Pay attention to that feeling," he said. "It's trying to help." That night, back home, he felt the tired satisfaction of someone who had used their experience without being defined by it. He cooked a simple meal and ate with her at the table. The windows opened to the warm air. They talked about nothing important. The ease mattered. Later, lying in bed, he considered how far the story had come from its beginning, how unfair it had felt to be the one who discovered, the one who waited, the one who gathered proof, while others carried on unburdened. He saw now that unfairness hadn't disappeared. It had transformed. It had sharpened his values. The following weeks brought a test that felt personal. A family gathering surfaced old dynamics, subtle expectations to smooth over tension, to avoid naming discomfort for the sake of harmony. He felt the familiar pull to comply. He didn't. When a comment crossed a line, he addressed it calmly, without accusation. The room stilled. Someone changed the subject too quickly. Later, an aunt thanked him privately for saying what others had avoided. He understood then that boundaries didn't just protect him, they gave others permission. On the drive home, he reflected on how often love was confused with accommodation. He had lived that confusion. He had paid for it. He would not perpetuate it. As the season turned, he and his partner discussed living arrangements, not as a milestone to check, but as a practical question. What would make life easier? What would preserve autonomy? They explored options without pressure. The conversation itself felt like progress. One afternoon, he found himself at a bookstore, browsing without purpose. He picked up a book on ethics he'd once dismissed as abstract. Skimming a chapter, he smiled at a passage about integrity as coherence between belief and action. Simple, demanding, accurate. He bought the book and read it slowly over weeks, underlining lines that resonated not because they were new, but because they named what he was already practicing. At work, the junior manager he'd mentored presented a proposal confidently, citing concerns clearly. The room responded with respect. He felt a quiet pride that wasn't ownership. Influence, he learned, didn't require credit. One evening, as they walked through a park, she asked him what he would tell his younger self, the one standing at the edge of discovery, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. He didn't answer immediately. "I'd tell him not to negotiate with confusion," he said finally, "and not to confuse patience with love." She squeezed his hand. The path ahead was dimly lit, leaves rustling underfoot. It felt right. Back at home, he wrote for a while, then stopped. Some things didn't need to be captured anymore. They were lived. The story had not ended in a dramatic reckoning or a perfect resolution. It had resolved into practice, noticing sooner, speaking plainly, choosing alignment over appearance. That was the real arc. As he turned off the light, he felt the steady assurance of someone who no longer needed to replace one truth with another to survive. He had learned to stand where he was, see what was there, and act accordingly. And in that steadiness, he knew the future would meet him honestly or not at all. Autumn returned with a clarity that felt earned. The heat had broken, the air sharpened, and with it came a sense of precision he welcomed. He noticed how the season mirrored his internal landscape: less excess, more definition. He moved through days with intention, choosing what to carry and what to leave behind. The decision to live together arrived without ceremony, not as a milestone to celebrate, but as a practical answer to overlapping lives. They found a place that felt neutral enough to become theirs without erasing either of them. They talked through finances, space, habits, and solitude. The conversations were unglamorous. They were also honest. He felt the quiet relief of knowing that nothing essential had been postponed for later. On moving day, boxes lined the hallway, labeled clearly. He smiled at the symbolism. There were no hidden compartments now. No items placed where they didn't belong. When something didn't fit, they adjusted instead of forcing it. The apartment filled slowly, intentionally. A shared table, separate desks, space to breathe. At work, the culture continued its subtle recalibration. People brought concerns earlier. Meetings grew shorter, decisions clearer. Not because conflict had disappeared, but because avoidance had lost its reward. He watched how alignment reduced drama more effectively than control ever could. An unexpected test arrived when a senior leader proposed an initiative that looked impressive on the surface but relied on selective reporting. The room hummed with enthusiasm. He felt the familiar tension between momentum and integrity. This time, he spoke before doubt could gather. "What assumptions are we making?" he asked calmly. "And who absorbs the risk if they're wrong?" The questions didn't derail the initiative. They refined it. The final plan was smaller, sturdier, accountable. Afterward, someone thanked him for slowing the room down. He recognized the irony. Slowing down had become a form of speed toward outcomes that lasted. One evening, unpacking the last box, he found a small stack of notes he had written during the earliest days of unraveling. Not timelines or evidence reflections, questions, statements he'd repeated to steady himself. He read them quietly. The urgency was palpable. The fear, too, but beneath it all was a commitment he had almost forgotten. "I will not abandon myself to preserve peace." He placed the notes in a drawer and closed it. The promise had been kept. The relationship deepened through ordinary stressors. A missed bill, a misunderstood comment, fatigue that shortened tempers. They handled these moments without escalation, returning to repair quickly. He noticed how repair didn't require self-blame or scorekeeping. It required curiosity. He felt grateful for the shared language they had built, one that made room for truth without threat. The past tested him again in a subtler way. A professional acquaintance circulated a flattering article that reframed Victor's downfall as a cautionary tale about ambition. Gone too far, sanitized, detached from the harm inflicted, he felt a flash of irritation, then something steadier. He wrote a brief response to the editor, factual and restrained, correcting the record without embellishment. The correction was published quietly. It was enough. That evening, he walked home thinking about how easily narratives could be laundered if no one intervened. He didn't need to champion the truth loudly. He needed to keep it accurate. At a small dinner with friends, conversation turned to relationships. Someone joked about ignoring the red flags because chemistry was worth it. Laughter followed. He didn't lecture. He shared a simple observation instead. Chemistry can be loud, he said. Safety is quieter. I pay attention to which one lasts. The table went quiet for a moment, then conversation resumed. Later, a friend pulled him aside and thanked him. She had been explaining something away for months, she said. Hearing it named helped. He understood then that his story had become a reference point, not as spectacle, but as permission. Winter approached again, this time without dread. He and his partner created rituals that grounded them, weekly planning sessions that ended early, walks after dinner. Time alone respected without suspicion. He felt the absence of vigilance as a gift. One night, as they prepared for sleep, she asked him what he feared now. The question surprised him. He searched himself honestly. I fear complacency, he said. Not conflict, not loss, complacency. She nodded. Me too. They agreed to keep noticing, to name discomfort early, to revisit assumptions, to let truth interrupt comfort when necessary. The agreement wasn't dramatic. It was practical. It felt sustainable. At work, the junior manager he'd mentored received a promotion. The announcement came with applause. He watched from the back of the room, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Influence without attachment had become a pattern. He liked it that way. Later, alone in his office, he thought about the man he had been at the beginning of this story, standing still, holding his breath, trying to decide whether to look closer or look away. He felt compassion for him. That decision had required courage he hadn't recognized at the time. He realized then that the most important shift hadn't been external. It was internal permission to trust perception, to act without consensus, to accept that clarity might cost comfort. That permission had changed everything. As the year drew toward its end, he and his partner discussed the future in measured terms. Not 5-year plans, values, non-negotiables. What they would do if one of them felt something wasn't right. The conversation felt less like planning and more like maintenance. On a quiet Sunday morning, he wrote for an hour, then stopped mid-sentence. The urge to complete the thought faded. He closed the notebook and smiled. Not everything needed to be finished. Some things needed to be lived. That afternoon, they hosted a few friends. The apartment filled with warmth, conversation overlapping, music low. He noticed how easy it was to be present without monitoring. How laughter didn't mask tension because tension wasn't being hidden. When the last guest left and the door closed softly behind them, he leaned against the counter, tired in a good way. He felt aligned, not euphoric, not triumphant, grounded. The story that began with injustice had not ended in revenge. The story that began with a substitution had resolved into coherence. He no longer replaced truth with symbols or silence with patience. He chose alignment, again and again, in small, unremarkable ways. As he turned off the lights and prepared for bed, he understood that the work would continue not as recovery, but as practice. And he welcomed it, because this time, the life he was building did not require him to disappear to survive. The first real test of their shared life came quietly. disguised as inconvenience. A leak appeared in the ceiling after a heavy rain, slow and persistent, dripping into a bowl they placed beneath it. It wasn't dramatic, but it demanded attention. Repairs meant schedules disrupted, money redirected, patience tested. He noticed how they approached it. No blame, no avoidance. They called a professional, reviewed options, made a decision, and moved forward. It was mundane. It was everything. He understood then that trust revealed itself most clearly in logistics, in how problems were handled when no one was watching, when there was nothing to perform. He felt grateful for the simplicity of that realization. At work, the rhythm intensified. A major project entered a critical phase, bringing pressure and competing interests to the surface. He felt the familiar pull to absorb more than his share, to keep things smooth. Instead, he redistributed responsibility clearly, naming expectations without apology. The team responded with focus. Accountability, once established, reduced friction rather than increasing it. Late one evening, as he reviewed documents, he noticed a subtle discrepancy, nothing illegal, but misleading if left unaddressed. The old pattern would have nudged him to flag it quietly, to suggest an adjustment without naming the underlying issue. He didn't do that. He documented it, raised it formally, and proposed a correction. The process took longer. The outcome held. When he returned home that night, tired but steady, she listened as he described the day. She didn't offer solutions. She didn't soothe. She reflected back what she heard, that he had acted in alignment, even when it cost time and comfort. The recognition mattered. The past surfaced again in a surprising way when he ran into Victor's name in an unrelated context, an article about industry regulation, a footnote referencing a case that had once dominated his life. The mention was brief, almost dismissive. He felt no surge of anger, no satisfaction either, just distance. The story had moved on, so had he. He noticed how often people mistook moving on for forgetting. He hadn't forgotten. He had integrated. The difference showed up in moments like this, when memory no longer dictated reaction. As winter settled fully, they established rhythms that protected space, weekly check-ins that weren't about problems, just orientation. Are we tired? Are we distracted? Are we avoiding something? The questions weren't accusatory. They were maintenance. He found relief in how normalized honesty had become. One night, during one of these conversations, she admitted feeling the urge to prove herself at work, to say yes reflexively, to avoid disappointing others. She recognized the pattern forming before it solidified. He listened, asking what support would be helpful without assuming. She asked him to check in when he noticed her stretching too far. The request felt mutual, not dependent. He reflected on how far he'd come from the man who once waited, who once hoped silence would resolve what clarity could not. He no longer outsourced his safety to optimism. A family visit brought another subtle challenge. Old dynamics resurfaced, jokes that crossed lines, expectations that he would smooth over discomfort for the sake of tradition. He didn't confront aggressively. He redirected calmly. When pressed, he named his boundary simply. The room adjusted. Some awkwardness lingered. It passed. Later, his father pulled him aside and said, "You're different, in a good way." He nodded. That was enough. Back home, he returned to writing, not analysis this time, but reflection. He wrote about repair as a skill, about how integrity wasn't loud, but it was consistent, about how love didn't need to be proven through endurance. He stopped when the words felt complete, even if the page wasn't full. The city slowed as holidays approached. Streets glowed, schedules loosened. He felt a quiet appreciation for this phase of life. The absence of crisis, the presence of intention. Peace, he had learned, wasn't passive. It was constructed, protected, renewed. One evening, they hosted a small dinner. Conversation meandered. Someone mentioned a recent breakup and laughed it off with bravado. He noticed the laughter didn't reach the eyes. He didn't intervene. He trusted that people found their own timing. After the guests left, he and his partner cleaned up together, moving easily around each other. He realized he no longer scanned for signs of withdrawal or deception. Trust had become the default, not the exception. That felt like a milestone he hadn't marked. As the year neared its end, he received a message from the junior manager he'd mentored, thanking him for guidance during a difficult conversation. The note was brief, sincere. He felt the quiet satisfaction of impact without attachment. Influence had become something he extended, not something he needed returned. He thought again about injustice, not as an event, but as a pattern that persisted. When people learned to tolerate misalignment, he had broken that pattern in his own life. He had seen how it rippled outward, not dramatically, but meaningfully. On a cold night, standing at the window, he reflected on the arc of his story, how it had begun with shock and humiliation, how unfair it had felt to carry awareness while others carried ease, how tempting it had been to harden, to retreat, to replace vulnerability with control. He hadn't done that. Not perfectly, but deliberately. The wedding photo, the symbol that had once anchored everything, now existed only as an archived artifact, stripped of power. He didn't need to destroy it. He didn't need to honor it. It had become what it always was, a moment, not a mandate. He turned away from the window and joined her on the couch. They sat quietly, the television on mute, the room warm. He felt no urge to narrate the moment, to extract meaning from it. Presence was enough. Before bed, he checked his calendar for the coming week. Meetings, dinners, a long walk planned, ordinary things. He smiled at how extraordinary ordinary had become. As he lay down, he felt the steady assurance of someone who had learned to respond rather than react, to choose alignment over appeasement, to trust discomfort as information rather than threat. The story was nearing its close, not because there was nothing left to learn, but because the central question had been answered. What do you do when love asks you to disappear? You refuse. And in that refusal, you begin again, whole, awake, and no longer willing to substitute yourself for the sake of peace. Sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't the lie itself. It's the moment we convince ourselves to stay silent so life can look normal again. This story reminds us that real love never asks us to disappear, to doubt our instincts, or to trade truth for comfort. When something feels wrong, that feeling is not weakness. It's wisdom trying to protect us. Healing doesn't come from revenge or perfect endings. It comes from choosing alignment over illusion, honesty over endurance, and self-respect over fear. Walking away from what hurts is not failure, it's courage. And rebuilding your life with clarity, boundaries, and integrity is the quiet kind of victory that lasts. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and what part hit closest to home. Your voice matters here, and if you enjoy deep, emotional stories about betrayal, growth, and healing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story.